welcome everyone to Code on the Table, organized by our team at Bugout. Sophia, my co-founder, is also on the call, so Sophia can wave.
Okay.
And yeah, so at Bugout, we're building public knowledge bases about code, discussions about code, issues, solutions to those issues. And we do most of our building in open source, like our static analyzers, data collectors, machine learning models, all of them are in open source. So over the course of the past year, we've been thinking very carefully about how to go about building a business around these open source projects that we have. And everyone on this panel, so Chip, Tyler, Kohsuke, and Chris, we've had conversations with them, and we found those conversations to be extremely useful. So we thought that we'd share their knowledge and their experience with the whole Bugout community, and they were kind enough to agree to sort of share their expertise in this panel discussion. So. As the discussion progresses, if you guys have questions for them, it's pretty casual. Just post your questions in the Zoom chat, and I'll pick them up as we go along. We have like a set, list of questions that we'll start with, but then you can ask your questions in the Zoom chat, and I'll relay the questions to the panelists. And at the end of the talk, so we'll have half an hour where you guys can actually just directly ask questions. So you can unmute yourselves and ask questions. Let me start by introducing our panelists. So first we have Chip Childers. He's executive director at Cloud Foundry Foundation. He actually started work. He co-founded Cloud Foundry in 2015. He was also the first VP of Apache Cloud Stack. So he's had a very long career in cloud computing. So we're very happy to have him here. Our next panelist is Tyler Jewell. Tyler has experience on both the investment side as well as the entrepreneurship side of, with open source, specifically technologies. He's currently managing director at Dell Technologies Capital, and before that, he was a CEO of two companies that sort of were based around open source. You guys might be familiar with CodeEnvy. He was a founder of CodeEnvy, which got acquired by RedHat, and they were built up around like the Eclipse Shea, like the cloud native sort of developer experiences. So Tyler brings that experience both from the investor side as well as the founding companies side of things. Kohsuke is the creator of Jenkins. Probably everybody here has used Jenkins at some point in their life. So Jenkins started off as a product when Kohsuke worked at Sun Microsystems. He started off over there, and then sort of spun it off into like the huge open source project that it became. Currently, he's working on a startup called Launchable, which he founded last year. And Launchable is focused on just reducing the feedback cycles in automated testing. So if you have ridiculously large groups of tests, you should go to Kohsuke and he'll help you improve your feedback loop with those tests. And then finally, we have Chris Wright. Chris is the CTO of RedHat. His office at RedHat is responsible for incubating emerging technologies and developing their positions on emerging technologies. He's been in the industry for 25 years. He started off in telecommunications. He's spent a lot of he's contributed to the Linux kernel, and his focus, in his engineering work, has been on security, networking, and virtualization. So those are our panelists. A very quick overview of everyone. And maybe, let's start with just describing sort of your journey in open source. Like, how did you get into it? And how do you perceive that it's changed, over the years? You guys have all been involved in open source for a long time. So how did you get into open source, and how has it changed over the years? Maybe let's start with Chip.
Sure. So I took the user path, into the space, and I mean, my career is a little over 20 years now, and the first half of it was working at a consultancy and then working at a big managed service provider, right? And so, back in the late 90s, you were using open source all the time, but there were very few people that were really participating in building it, and just so many more users of it, right? Everything from which web server you're going to host the app on, to a lot of the development frameworks that we were using existed then. Fast forward a bit, and we as a user, we started to rely on open source projects that were sufficiently complex enough in the enterprise infrastructure space that we needed to start to support the upstream development. And it wasn't really so much a scratch your own itch type of situation for us. It was truly just looking at it like a risk management activity. And that kind of drove me into the upstream communities. I started participating there. And I think about that exact same time was when we saw the rise of open infrastructure begin to see heavy commercialization, right? Like OpenStack was rising, just certainly there were successful companies commercializing open source, but I think it was this pivot point in the industry where open source became almost the default for enterprise technology, for at least many enterprise technologies. And so then kind of fast forward to today, I think we're in a very different, materially different world, right? There's a saying, software's eating the world, all companies are software companies. And then we're going to talk about open source in the context of commercialization. I think every company is actually an open source software company. They just may not realize it, right? Because if you're using any technology as part of your company, there's all kinds of open source embedded inside of it. And so the question is just how much of it are you consuming and how important is it? And how much of a commodity is it, right? Can you swap it out for other options? So I don't know, just my brief history there.
Cool, thanks, Chip. Let's go, maybe Tyler next. You can explain your journey.
Sure. Hi, everybody. So my journey, I started off actually as an investor in 2009. We made a $5 million investment in a company called WSO2, which was predominantly based out of Asia Pacific. And at the time, they were very actively involved with a couple of core projects in the Apache Software Foundation. But more importantly, the founders had very strong principles about the nature of software. And so they had this strong commitment that all their intellectual property was going to be Apache licensed. And so it wasn't an open core model. It wasn't their intention to be an open core model. They felt that they could both build great open software and build a great business along the way. And joined the board and spent 8 or 9 years on the board there. My second step with open source was I had founded CodeEnvy in 2011. And it was originally a hosted SaaS-based cloud IDE. We were up around 1 million active users with the system, but the business model around SaaS and hosted environments wasn't that strong at the time. And we were one of these unusual companies that made the leap into open source after we had already built the SaaS. And so we took the core engine of CodeEnvy and transformed that into a single user hosted cloud IDE and open sourced it and gave it to the Eclipse Foundation. And that was, a pretty tremendous journey because I was project lead, and we had very different goals with Eclipse Che than we did with our originally hosted software. And that was a pretty hard and difficult transition, but a successful one because we did get eventually acquired by RedHat, which has done some things in the open source realm, as I'm sure you'll hear from the other panelists. And then in the third step, I became CEO of WSO2 after CodeEnvy, after being on the board for 8 years, and I ran that company until it was about 700 employees, and really lived the experience of what it's like trying to be responsible for about 50 million in revenue and 700 employees, all doing open source on that business model. And it wasn't open core, and so we had really interesting dynamics at play. With everything being Apache licensed, and I think we learned some really subtle nuances on that.
Great. Actually, I have definitely some questions about the open core business model and how you can what the different possible dynamics are. But maybe let's ask them afterwards. Next, let's do Kohsuke. We'd love to hear about your journey in open source.
Sure. So I grew up in Tokyo, right? So as far as the software industry goes, it's like a no-real land. Let's be real. So for me, in many ways, I owe it entirely to open source. Like I ended up here. So the first encounter to open source is with actually a man named James Clark, and he's actually involved in WSO2 afterwards. So Tyler, you might actually know him.
James, a great friend, yeah, out of Hong Kong.
Yeah. So in him, so he's like a lone genius engineer, and his brain is literally bigger. I took a picture of that. So, I saw like you could be. The open source is like an incredible level playing field. Like if you feel like you have something to offer, you could do it, even if you're in Bangkok or Tokyo or in the Silicon Valley. Then subsequently, like one of those open source projects that I've done, like I got attention from Sun, and that brought me to the US. And then, later I created what became Jenkins, and that also kind of that's a key part of whatever little visibility that I might have now. So I literally built my career around open source. And it's also like, it's not just a tool or like economic means. I feel like, open source is a bit of a movement. There's this like a value attraction to many people, right? So I think I got a great joy and satisfaction out of being around this movement. Maybe something, those things could be a little dangerous at times. Like sometimes I look at people around the cryptocurrency and I feel the similar vibe, and I don't hold it in the same positive light that I do with open source, but maybe other people see it in the same manner. So that's I think for me, open source it really means a lot in many ways. And now, now I'm doing Launchable. It's a new company, and there's not as much involvement in open source as some of my previous, the projects have been. But still, the open source is a great mechanism to build the ecosystem, and I learned how to take advantages of that. So some of what we do now is indeed in open source. So yeah, so I guess that's me.
Thanks, Kohsuke. And then Chris, we'd love to hear about your journey as well.
Well, like Chip, I started as a user, and my motivations were pretty simple. I couldn't afford a $20,000 Spark box to do Unix work in my basement, which I was using Unix at work. I was fascinated with the technology, but I didn't have 20 grand laying around to sort of learn on my own at home. So a friend of mine introduced me to Linux. I proceeded to dial up, download 50 floppies of Slackware and install it on a 486. And that was really exhilarating for two reasons. One, it was a lot to learn, and I had this experience where I had an environment that was similar to Unix, and I could play around with it. Two, it started to introduce me into a world that I didn't actually know existed. And not long after that, I was working on a project. We used a lot of the GNU tool chain, even on Unix at the time. So I was familiar with the tools, and I went to Sunsite to load up any Unix box with Bash and all the things that you might take for granted now in Linux. But it wasn't long before I was contributing to an open source project. And that for me was an actual life-changing moment. Being able to use the technology was fun, and I really enjoyed that. Contributing to a project, which was the Linux HA project, probably in the late 90s. The fact that as a relatively young person with not a lot of knowledge in the high availability space, the fact that I could contribute to a project with essentially world-leading experts in this technology space was truly mind-boggling. It was humbling, it was exciting, and I was thrilled that I could contribute to a project like that, and it completely shifted my focus, my professional focus, and I was lucky enough at the time to find a job to support me doing full-time contributions into open source projects. And that was well over 20 years ago, and that's really defined my entire career. So for me, open source was first about using, and then that contribution and the ability to really learn from some of the brightest people on the planet was just, I just can't express how staggering and exciting that was. And then the whole kind of community of people that I've met over the years through that process has just reinforced that was a great fork in the road, and I took the right path. So that's my story.
And have you noticed, actually it's very interesting because you're at Red Hat, and Red Hat was like one of the pioneers for like, showing how something that was open source could actually turn into like, a very successful business. Have you noticed like those dynamics around businesses, built around open source changing, like, ever since you got involved? Like, have you noticed that open source communities think about money differently or think about contributions differently since you started?
Well, that's a pretty dense question. The short answer is yes. Everything has changed. But at the same time, some things haven't. So the early days was the commercial context for open source was about convincing people it was even a rational and sane thing to do, despite the fact that many developers were using things like the GNU toolchain already, but really embracing a more broad usage of open source software in a business context. That was really trying to convince people that they weren't introducing something that was risky into their business. That conversation is not gone completely, but it's so rare compared to where it was, say, 20 years ago. The communities were really sort of celebrated as altruistic, hobbyists, technology evangelists, folks really focused on the technology, not really thinking about or caring about or focusing on the commercial outlet. And I'd say super broadly, communities still operate with the same ethos of really wanting to improve the technology, but the individuals today are largely professionally employed to do the work they're doing in communities, which was not always the case. So there's been a pretty big shift in how basically people can make their livelihood around open source software development. I don't think it's fundamentally changed communities, but communities have evolved to take on some understanding of the fact that there is a business context and there are needs that aren't purely driven by the motivation for technical excellence. So introducing a new feature that you can't easily upgrade to might have been easy in the early days when you always recompiled and you just reinstalled, and now people think about what are the commercial aspects or the commercial impacts of an update, and projects even put governance around that today, which is just very new and different from how it was, in the earlier days. Sorry.
Yeah, that shift to the expectation about commercialization, or the shift to the expectation of the consumer to see more professionalism out of communities has been really fascinating to watch.
Yeah, I feel like that Red Hat really puts the open source on the map for the whole new audience that is like enterprise users, IT people, and that's been incredible. I feel like the so like a professionally employed engineers working on open source happened somewhat, I think, earlier. It felt like, I remember Apache was nominally, supposed to be individuals or driving these, projects, but in reality, they're all working for other companies. So I think it's, but yeah, so I think the Red Hat in my mind, like a key shift in this, like, how the open source works. But there is this other shift, like composition in enterprise. I mean, to the employed developers in open source, like compared to the days of Richard Stallman,
Actually, so Tyler, you actually made a comment about like, how free software plus like, the way that we host software these days, for example, on DigitalOcean, and then how it can help small teams like do great things. It's really, so Kohsuke and Chris, they were talking about like how it works with enterprise teams. This is a pretty different perspective with startups. And what I've seen at startups, I've worked at a lot of startups, is you can do a lot with open source software as users, but there's very little interaction with these small, like, at least with the teams that I've been on, back to the open source communities whose software that we're using. Are you seeing those dynamics change? Like, how does that work? Yeah.
So your question is about whether companies are giving back more?
Yeah, exactly. Like, what's the benefit to the open source communities? Because when you're talking like those are, you have teams building businesses around open source, and then you have the open source communities which are actually producing a lot of the value. It seems like there's not much like value going back into the open source communities in that dynamic.
Well, I think you have to look at the presumption or the makeup of the people who are contributors and maintainers to that project. I think that when you look at large scale open source projects now, the mix of where those people come from has shifted a bit. So I think, as KK pointed out, or Chris earlier, that 20 years ago, the makeup of the maintainers were all volunteers, right? And so their motivation was, probably technical excellence, or maybe there was some economic or even some cultural motivation for why they were contributing at the end of the day. Over time, there used to be this case where a lot of people were still individual contributors, but then as it became more popular, then commercial companies would start hiring people to be full-time contributors. And so there'd be a blended mix on that front. And so there'd be some balance between, how you apply governance, how do you set roadmap, how do you set direction between, these people who are all contributing on that front. And now, because open source is seen as a marketing vehicle in many ways and a go-to-market vehicle, there are some open source projects which are really large, which are, everybody is an employee of some company at the end of the day. And so for those projects that have a lot of people who are employees at different companies, you have to go into what that company's strategy for working with the open source is. Some of those companies are just consumption of that, and so this is an R&D offload cost in many ways because they don't have to build it and maintain it internally. Other companies are trying to build businesses on top of that, and so in order for them to build businesses on top of that, giving back may be a fundamental tenet to the principles that they've got. In other cases, those companies may be particularly private, or a hosted provider, that starts with the letter A, that just likes to take open source and host it for their own benefit to monetize it in other ways. So I think you have to look at the dynamics and the nature of the business models of those companies. But more often than not, I think that the open source abusers get profiled more than the companies who are not open source abusers. And for the most part, most companies are not open source abusers, and so their default policy is to give back where they can, particularly on people who are compensated and full-time and allocated to a project out there on that front.
Actually, I'm curious. So I wanted to ask you about WSO2 anyway, because it's it wasn't an open core, it isn't an open core business model. How does the business model work over there, and how are their interactions with the people who are using?
Well, yeah. So ideally, so first it's on-prem software. It's integration software. And so there's a lot of moving parts with integration software. So there's a ton of complexity that goes with it. And usually with integration software, this is running the backbone of most companies that deploy it. So warranties, indemnification, a very unusual high response time SLA, and a support quality of service are really essential in that sort of environment. So first is, you can sell a subscription in and around that. That's not sufficient though, because, if you do a good job, like all of us strive to do with our software, if the software becomes so stable or the project is so long in the tooth, there's not a lot of motivation, for people to continue to pay the subscription fee on that if everything's Apache licensed. So what we did, which is a little bit of a variant on the RedHat business model, but actually worked out really well for us, is that we lived up to our open source ideals on a code basis, but on a support patch basis, we deviated from that. And what we did was, if you were a customer on support with us and you had a particular issue that required a patch, we would backport that patch internally. We would create a binary for that patch, and we had a whole patch distribution mechanism. That binary wasn't open source. The code for it was. The code for the patch would go into the main branch in the latest version, we wouldn't the backport would be private. So that was only us. The binary was be term licensed and given to the customer. And it created this nice tension, because if a customer wanted to cancel the subscription, which is fine for us, they'd have to uninstall all the patches, go into the mainline, compile the software, and then reinstall the software themselves. And that's how we dealt with that tension. And it turns out, most customers would choose to give us money as opposed to downgrading open source.
Yeah.
On that front.
Actually, I'm curious.
KK, he's like, what?
No,
go ahead, Kohsuke.
No, well, I had the similar experience, but also on the engineering side, this was a kind of, building open source, viable business around open source, it's so difficult. Even when the open source project is successful, perhaps even precisely when the project is successful. So that experience was fascinating. And so I don't know what magic RedHat pulled off, but it's really
actually. Did you experience something like that with Jenkins? Did you have that sort of competition with like the open source Jenkins as a business model at CloudBees?
So we did everything from like a training to professional services to support, and indeed during some of the time period we did these custom like a longer sustaining trails, and that helped us for a while. We did enterprise edition, like more feature on top. I think we did everything, just about every business model conceivable over a period of time, because I think that may be the key for me. Depending on certain things you can only do when the company is bigger. Like if you're a 3-people company, nobody's going to buy support from you. So that was fascinating to hear from that.
Actually, one thing Tyler mentioned was a hosting company whose name starts with A, who's like very happy hosting open source projects profitably. I'm curious, Chip, if this, if you've had to deal with like this hosting company eating into your business with Cloud Foundry.
No, we're an open source foundation, right? Yeah. So no, but also I don't know if this is perhaps a opinion that might not be held by everybody here, but my argument is that I don't think that Amazon consuming open source projects and turning them into services represents a misuse of code. I actually think that if someone, and there are some clear examples here, if there are organizations or companies that see it as a misuse of things, then they haven't structured their product strategy thoughtfully enough. Because what they're essentially doing when they're open sourcing a code base, especially if they're trying to go with an open core model, which I think is just inherently like this time-bound, setup that you have that's just going to erode if you have success at adoption of the project. I don't see the Amazon behavior as being anything other than a benefit to the market overall, right? Because they're taking an open source project that has some sort of community wrapped around it, and they're saying, here is a way to have a managed capability of that software. And so while I feel bad for the investors of companies that have taken a core model that then see that get eroded through managed offerings that, where there's not a lot of value flowing back to the upstream project, I think that it was set up for that to occur anyway, right? And so it's a question of, how does a company that wants to do both a community around an open source project and a commercial business where they kind of bolt on some capabilities and features, will that work? When I said open core, I think is this time-bounded advantage that people might have, or commercial differentiator that you might have. It's because if you are successful at building a community, if you've built something that is outside of that open core, that's proprietary, that you're charging for, if there's value to the consumer, then it's likely that community is going to create it. But I think the most novel solution to open core, and this might in fact be the only solution to that open core conundrum, is the way that GitLab has approached this, right? They've taken a persona-based approach to commercializing certain features, where they've said, look, if it's a developer-oriented feature, it's gonna get eaten away, right? Like the community's gonna build versions of it. If it's a high-level capability that, for example, executive dashboarding for the purpose of compliance, is a developer going to feel like they should scratch their own itch and go build that? Maybe not, right? Will a department manager maybe say, hey, we're going to build this and as an open source thing and not pay for it anymore? Maybe a little bit more likely. But you could see that, if you look at the personas themselves and their personal likelihood to just want to write a check versus dig into some code, right? And it's a spectrum. You're more likely to be successful commercializing the things where writing a check is easier and faster. So I think that might be the only way that you can sustain that open core position, given that there's a big push for managed offerings.
So basically, the key difference between that and something like Redis or Elasticsearch is that there's no time-based unlocking of those paid features. Is that the big difference between like what GitLab is doing and what these other companies are doing?
I think that what it is, it's a natural defense against that community erosion of your differentiator, right? Your commercial differentiator, because it's like if there's no desire within the community of those that are capable of doing it to build that feature, but yet it has value to someone who has a checkbook, that to me is interesting, right? Okay. But the inverse is also true. If it's something that could be built by someone who's in the community and not working for your company, it's likely it's going to be built, right? So go ahead and get money if you can. If you're building an open source startup, get the money while you can, but understand that that's going to erode very quickly if you're successful and your project's adopted.
So, I mean, this whole Amazon thing, I think one of the things that spells is that the vendor-backed open source, vendor-led vendor-backed open source project is on decline. And I think the end user-driven projects are more on the rise, and that's a good thing. Or, well, it just is. I guess it's better or worse. It's what it is. But one thing I do miss in these like a vendor-backed projects is, like when the project gets bigger and then you need to drive a big effort that kind of cuts across individual concerns, like there are certain things end users or like they just don't care about. So the force to drive this project that takes multiple different people, that gets harder. And so, I'm hoping, well, one of the reason I have a lot of respect for Linux Foundation is like it's figuring out this, what seems like a different scheme to shove more resources into open source by translating money from these like rich end user companies and using that to fund their development. So if that can be combined to like, I don't know, like to take some of the place that the vendor-led open source project left behind, thinking of the big picture and like rally resources around the area that needs to be done, that would be amazing next phase of open source that I'm kind of looking forward to.
Actually, it's interesting, like about community-driven open source projects, because I feel like for a lot of community-driven open source projects that I've been part of, it's not really like a community of end users ultimately that's driving. Like for successful products, it's not just a community of like regular users that are driving priorities, but rather like corporate users of those products, which is a little bit different of a dynamic, right? Like, is that something that you've noticed as well, Kohsuke? That I wonder if anyone's done an analysis, right? Like of email addresses with like of commits to open source projects by like what their corporate emails are or something like this.
When I say like end users, I do mean like a corporate users, because I'm thinking about software like Redis or Kubernetes or Jenkins. So those users tend to be corporate users themselves, but like they don't drive, like for example, they don't care about the making the software easier to use, right? They've already crossed that hurdle. Like their use case is more complicated and they're trying to scratch the itch at that horizon. Whereas if somebody is thinking about like a product manager of that open source project, then getting new people like to use the product is incredibly important. So like I think in the vendor-led project, vendors tend to care about those, so they do it. But I feel like that's the area that I
think one of the subtleties that is lost when we talk about community-driven or vendor-driven is what was the motivation for the vendor putting an open source project out there. And it's not oftentimes to actually get end users of it. What it often is actually to try to build partnerships with other technology vendors that have like-minded concerns. When we open sourced Eclipse Che, we obviously were thrilled that we had a lot of individual users. But the big part of it is, since it was a hosted, a single user cloud desktop, hosted cloud desktop IDE environment, we were really trying to drive integrations with all the sorts of plugins that, traditional desktop IDEs had. So most of the work that we needed to do in the Eclipse chain was, was SAP, Software AG, Oracle, Microsoft, to do particular types of things that could create important experiences on that. And so our measure of, hey, was this a successful project, was how many outside vendor contributors that we could get on that particular interface, and driving that as a standardization exercise. And we put a lot more work into that than the end user promotion of it on that front. So I think that happens a lot, and that's a lot of motivation, because open source is a great way to establish standards without having to write a specification and go to a standards body.
Right.
Actually, I'm curious, Chris, in terms of vendor-led open source projects, like, how do you, at Red Hat, like, how do you think about Red Hat open source projects, and, how do you measure success? Like, is it along the lines that Tyler said, or is it something different?
It's hard to broad brushstroke. Like, there's literally millions of projects. They fall in different categories. Some are major industry focal points. Linux, even, maybe you have to go to the kernel because there's different distributions, but the core of Linux creates a focal point, which has that ecosystem effect that Tyler was describing, where it's really critical that you have a de facto standard for the industry. Kubernetes is emerging in a similar space where it creates that focal point. There are many projects that have, and in those, diversity of contributions really is a key measure. And generally speaking, I think more of these contributions are coming from companies than individuals. Again, oversimplification. There's other projects where it's completely different. I mean, there are, especially when you get into a language and language runtimes and specific modules that do one thing and do it well, it might be maintained and developed by basically one person. Maybe hundreds, thousands, or more people are depending on that. And so it's hard to put it all in one context. But for those larger projects, I do think it's about creating de facto standardization for the industry, which creates a kind of efficiency, because it's now a broad industry focal point. And the one thing that I think is, when you're thinking from a startup point of view, it's certainly tempting to use open source as a way to create mind share. There is no magic that magically converts mind share to market share. It's just honest hard work, and it's about differentiated products. It's about your go-to-market strategy. It's like a whole set of things that I think it's easy to be dismissive of and just assume with massive mind share you immediately create market share, and it just isn't true. It's much harder than that. And creating the ecosystem, creating the right commercial value so that it's meaningful for customers to consume, not just people pulling the software directly as open source software. Those are actual hard problems to grapple with. And I think what we're seeing is there's not one obvious answer. There's a lot of subtleties and a lot of creative options. And I would 100% agree with Chip that there's the value line keeps moving north. So if you're trying to create a clear separation between a core and some ancillary supporting proprietary value, you have to be prepared that that's just going to disappear over time, unless you have a clever way of, like the persona-based model, unless you have a clever way of ensuring that that's really uniquely valuable to a customer base that isn't going to be motivated in the open source project to reintroduce that. And I'm not sure that that's going to prove sustainable, even if you have a clear persona model, because it only takes enough of those personas to get motivated to then attack that problem in the open source project. I do think when you go to the cloud providers, and if you have more of a single vendor-led open source project and a cloud provider producing that as a service, good, bad, and different, what it does create is a real asymmetry in the investment and the monetization, and that's not sustainable. So I think we have to address that as, how do you create sustainable models for those community projects. And you could argue that starts with the vendor that created the project, but it's certainly not sustainable. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is software communities are about features and the feature velocity, and operationalizing that software is typically left as an exercise for the end user. When you offer software as a service, you're taking that operationalization and building that and then delivering the whole thing as an end service. There's a huge community opportunity to think about the operationalization of software as well as the features and functionality of software together as one whole. I think there's something that's really interesting there, and it could rebalance that power dynamic. So it's not just proprietary operationalized software that cloud providers can then consume and not give back. But I think it creates some real opportunity, and I'm curious to see how we evolve as open source communities in that space.
Actually, someone in the chat mentioned that writing grandma an email automation tool is easy. Telling her why it doesn't work is hard, and that really is about operationalizing operationalization challenges. Sorry, I got stuttered on that for a second.
And it even goes to the core software architecture. If you look at things like both Cassandra and Mongo have software, but then they also have SAP software that's offered as a service. And you look at what you need to do to the software to make it easy to operate. There's telemetry, there's how many services do you make that overall application out of? How do they depend on one another? That whole kind of software architecture choice can be very deeply influenced by what it means to operate that software. And I think that's a really fantastic, healthy influence that we've not fully incorporated into many of the open source development projects processes.
Actually, I'm curious, what sort of a role do you see for like the cloud marketplaces, like AWS Marketplace, Google Cloud Marketplace? I'm sure DigitalOcean has a marketplace. I'm surprised that I don't see more open source projects like just offer have marketplace offerings where the revenue goes directly back into the like open source, whatever foundation is responsible for it, or whatever organization is responsible for it. I'm just surprised I don't see more of that. Do you have a sense why, or do you think that like that's coming? Do you think there's some role for these marketplaces to play?
Well, the marketplaces are commercial spaces, and open source projects either don't have a commercial entity, or if they do, it's typically a nonprofit commercial entity. So the structures aren't really set up properly to support something like that. There are some interesting attempts to sort out how you could deliver that monetization, deliver that to the developers with companies like Tidelift that are trying to spread the wealth of consumption of open source software, but it doesn't, I'm not sure if that fits exactly into a marketplace context. I think there is opportunity to think about how communities offer services, and maybe it's just a lower SLA. So maybe it's just like the software is available freely, free as in beer, not speech. Maybe the service could be available with a lower SLA at that, and certain types of interface compatibility guarantees that might not exist as you would in a more commercial context. That might be a way to create an outlet for open source projects to get direct service access to users. There are some attempts in that space. Open Infrastructure Labs is building something to do exactly that. So I think we'll see more of that activity in the open source communities over the next few years, and see what works.
Yeah. Actually, I'm curious, Chip, with Cloud Foundry Foundation, does the foundation can it arrange these kinds of monetization opportunities for individual projects, or is that something that you guys have been thinking about or talking about?
Yeah, so to me, while I think there might be some interesting explorations there that the industry writ large could do, I think that the idea that A, communities themselves, or B, these not-for-profit or non-profit, right? Kind of, there's a difference between a trade group and a charity, and both are used. I don't believe that the nexus of the community should be directly commercializing, I guess is the way to look at this. And my thinking behind this is that essentially, if a project exists in a true community, it's not like a single vendor owned and controlled open source project with you know, one primary commercialization engine, you know, that's like feeding the engineering work to continue to build it. To me, that's a startup, right? That you shouldn't structure that as a, think of that as a community. You shouldn't think of that as a nonprofit, you know, entity, right? I think that's the startup problem. That's the open core question, or the do you offer as a SaaS question. So if it's truly community driven, what you don't want to do is put that community as a either actual entity or as like an emergent entity of a bunch of people. You don't want to put it in competition with those that are part of the ecosystem, right? So someone else who is commercializing. Because I think if you cause that competition, you're no different than, let's say, you know, I'll use Docker as an example. Docker working to figure out how to commercialize the, you know, that initial portfolio of projects in competition with those that they had invited into their community, right? That was kind of a weird dynamic, and it doesn't work right. These dynamics are hard enough. You know, if you take any decently sized ecosystem, you can map out value flow. And sometimes that value is coming in terms of money. Sometimes it's coming in terms of, you know, R&D effort. And there's other types of value that can flow around the system. I'm not convinced that the center of that system can, in fact, be competing with the nodes around it in any way that would work long term. I mean, I could be totally proven wrong, but that's sort of the way I've always thought about that.
Actually, I'm curious, Tyler, like, because you're probably seeing like new efforts coming up, like, you know, in your work as a VC, like, you know, since you talked to so many developer tools companies, are you seeing anything interesting? Like, you know, are there companies that are coming up that are sort of challenging their community the way that Chip mentioned, like, would be impossible? It seems difficult to imagine, but like, you know.
So you're asking about, are there going to be innovations on open source or open source communities from up and coming startups?
Yeah, yeah.
I'm gonna say yes, and I'm gonna say it's Docker.
Okay.
Docker, as was just pointed out, was a remarkable exercise in how not to run a community, and I think the commercial results were pretty remarkably disaster at the end of the day. And they ultimately, you know, had to recapitalize the company. They sold off their enterprise business, which was almost 50 million in sales, I think, to Mirantis. 300 employees went. And what's remarkable is that since that time, in the year and a half, since they did all that work, their business has exploded. And the business on most of Merit's, you know, I can't give specifics on it, is really remarkable. I mean, the level of growth that's there. They're well over 10 million users, and the reason that the business has focused, even though it's still an open source technology, and Docker now focuses on Docker Desktop and developer tooling, is that they focus that the control point is not so much on hosted as a service, but around content. And they see that content, which is uniquely curated by and for Docker, with them being kind of the exclusive provider of that sort of content, is a bit of a business control point that forces the community to come back in, make use of the open source technology in greater forms. But then as a result, there's some sort of licensing obligation, because people do need to have performance SLA and rights to that content. And when I say content here in the Docker context, it's the, you know, roughly 170 or so base images that they've curated. Those base images have unique short names associated with them. And most people don't realize this, but those base images are also powered. 80% of all the other images on the planet are built off of one of those base images. And technically, you know, trademark and licensing and usage rights, you actually have to have a commercial arrangement with Docker in order to gain certain rights for use on those base images on that front. So I think that's been an innovative. you know, it allows their open source technology to proliferate, allows a lot of free usage, but in terms of the vendor relationships, they focus around the content on that front. So I think that's pretty interesting.
So you need to have an agreement with Docker, even if you just pull from one of those images in your own image.
Not if you pull from it. Let's say you wanted to provide a mirror, like JFrog might want to provide for a mirror. If you're willing to rename and rebrand that particular image into something ... you can do that. But if you want that image to be also the original name for people to use, then JFrog needs to have an arrangement with Docker on that.
It does highlight a business challenge, which is the project name, the company name, and the commercial product name all being the same creates a trademark disaster. And we saw that play out in real time with Docker specifically, where community members got really frustrated at their basically commercial constraints around the usage of what felt like a community-owned trademark. So that's a great thing to pay attention to in creating a business, maintaining clarity and separation of where it's a community effort, where it's a commercial effort, and where it's just the corporate entity. And it, you know, blurring those lines, I think, can be really challenging. Just as Chip described, that community project creating a commercial entity that competes with other commercial entities, you create perverse incentives, and suddenly you're competing with your own community, and that's really damaging.
I learned about
Trademarks are a whole.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Kohsuke.
I was just saying I learned about the trademark problem the hard way myself. So.
I was going to ask, you probably have some experience there.
Hudson.
Yeah. Trademarks are, you know, it's funny when you talk about, when you have open source as a topic, you know, we tend to default in, you know, in our conversations and talking about code, right? Which is sort of a copyright and licensing conversation, and then the dynamics wrapped around it. I think when we talk about like, where are we in the open source world? I think we've actually reached a point where we're, as an industry, starting to come to a much better collective understanding that trademarks are, in fact, the point of leverage that a community, that a company, you know, that can actually exert, and they're almost more important in a lot of ways than the code itself, which might sound like a very strange thing to say, right? And I'm not sure I could back it up entirely, but you know, the code's a manifestation of an idea, right? But that idea ends up, you know, we refer to that idea with a name. And so when the name starts becoming pervasive, you effectively have ownership over that idea, regardless of how it's implemented. So there's the interesting thing that Google did around the Istio project, right? It's service mesh technology. There's a lot of contention, or was a lot of contention, around this notion of Istio's trademark continuing to be owned by Google, even as they rejiggered project governance around how the code is built, you know, how the community makes decisions about forward features. And I think possibly this is the first time with their open, what do they call this? Chris will remind me probably if I get it wrong, but is it the Open Usage Commons? Is that what they called that?
Right.
Yeah. So they're experimenting with this idea of taking the trademark only and moving that out of the corporate entity that was originally sponsoring the project, and that's pretty fascinating. So pay attention to your trademarks, not just in the Docker use case, but in the case of where a community, in the case of Istio, the name was brought from someone else, brought into the project that Google stewarded, and then, you know, the code itself didn't move to a neutral entity. So it's just been fascinating to watch that dynamic play out.
Actually, maybe it's a good time to open up questions to the rest of the bug out community, because it seems like there's been a lot of comments, like, you know, as we've been talking. So if anyone would like to ask a question, Sophia, can they unmute themselves?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. So you can just unmute yourself and ask questions as you want.
Hi, this is Vikram here. First off, thank you all. This has actually been a very interesting, informative discussion. I'm, CEO of a enterprise 5G startup, and we're actually playing around with a open source model where we're kind of like, you have like that developer open source version for the developer community, and then we have like an enterprise version that we would charge an annual fee to enterprises. Question, because I wanted your perspective, because some of the early feedback we've gotten is that enterprise CIOs still don't like integrating open source into their environments. Just kind of just wanted, to the entire like panel, just want your perspectives on that in terms of what do you see in terms of enterprise adoption of large scale open source software, and not just as a fringe.
I'll tell you my experience. It's pervasive. It's absolutely everywhere, different levels. So what I mentioned earlier was the early days, it was all about convincing people they weren't insane to consider putting open source into their business. You're not having that same conversation. It doesn't mean that variants of that conversation still exist or there's some kind of latent concerns, but it is absolutely pervasive in all large enterprises. It's less about is open source safe in general, and more about the actual relationship. How does that source come into the company? Is it used internally in lines of businesses doing development? Is it used as a dependency for IT infrastructure? And those conversations can go down different paths. So I'm not surprised to hear that you find some hesitancy, but it's just so different than what it was in the past that to me it's pervasive. And obviously I have a skewed perspective because every customer I'm talking to about open source software, and they know to expect that in the conversation with me. But yeah, I find it's not the barrier that it was.
I'm actually very surprised to have heard that there's reticence, right? Because even in the telecom space, which, if you think there's pockets of industry that the problem domain is one where when they deploy technology, it's likely to have to exist for decades, right? And so it becomes very hard for them to unwind a deployment. That might apply to something like an edge device that's being placed somewhere, or it could be in the case of like the telecoms. They took a while to come around to open source, but they've really accelerated their adoption. The reason why they took so long is that they were used to these incredibly high demands on the software for quality of service, and if a small low-level component goes wrong, it has massive implications to their business. And so they were really kind of slow movers in adoption. I've personally seen, though, that most of the telecoms, even in their core, are adopting open source technologies largely because of the benefits, and they've gotten more comfortable with it. But the architecture and the patterns of a lot of the open source projects that they're bringing into their core are fundamentally about shifting from the slow pace of change to making their infrastructure much more agile and capable of adapting to changing consumer demands and business demands. This notion of like they can't stay in one spot because the market around them is not going to stay in one spot. And I think the whole 5G movement is fundamentally about being able to do a lot more with our telecom infrastructure. So I'm actually very surprised to have heard that there are CIOs pushing back on the use.
Could it be because of the size of the company that's like pushing the open source project, right? There's probably a phase transition, right?
No,
I mean,
the size of the company is not a factor. Look, I can give you another proxy. I mean, we, over the past 6 months, probably have evaluated close to 200 early stage startups. And those startups, which are backed by a growing and successful open source project, particularly in the data observability, data infrastructure, analytics, middleware, security infrastructure layers, when you look at those businesses that are coming online, some of those businesses are getting abnormally large investor checks for such early stage, $30 to $50 million, and getting valuations as high as 100 times their revenues. There are definitely $1 million revenue companies out there getting $100 million valuations on that front. And so as a proxy, investors, a big part of the investors and how they make their decisions on investments is maintaining active industry connections, CIOs, CTOs, chief delivery officers. And so if you look at those valuations and the amount of capital that's going in, that's a proxy for how confident or the expectation that fast growing open source is going to be proliferated throughout enterprises on that front. The investors wouldn't be taking that sort of abnormal level of risk if they weren't very confident on that front.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Alan.
Right. Let's have another question from the community. Somebody wants to ask.
Hi, I guess I'll go next. Hi guys, thanks again for having this. My name's Harman. I'm hoping to make an open source journaling and note-taking application. And the model that I was thinking about using was basically making it open source and available to people who want to self-host and use that way. But if they wanted to have it managed by us, that would be like a $5 a month, $10 a month sort of plan, sort of like Evernote. But I want to avoid basically, I guess, a competitor, like someone else commercially hosting the software. So if you want for your own personal use to self-host it, I think that would be okay. And I was just wondering if you guys are familiar with a model like that, or if there's a particular license that kind of uses that model.
Yeah, there are licenses that use the model, but maybe I would ask you the question: why are you creating it as an open source project then? What are you looking to get out of the openness of the core?
I just think that if it's something that's managing your personal ideas and personal sort of and your personal, it's more like a journal and note-taking application, that it should be open source so that you know what's going on. And I kind of saw it as a value proposition for a certain demographic. Again, like the extensibility and sort of having a community that builds the project as well was kind of what I was going for.
I'd say the licenses that support models like that are all relatively new, and to overgeneralize, not really considered open source licenses. So you're in this very strange space of sort of navigating open source principles and concepts, constraining them with a license that's kind of at odds with the open source principles. It's really it is really difficult in part. If you don't think about the self-hosted versus managed versus self-hosted kind of environment, but just generally why open source, you really have to be prepared that the software project will take direction well beyond what you ever intended, which could include competition. That's just part of the risk. That's part of the gamble. Typically, for large infrastructure type projects, the non-differentiated part of the project is so important to so many people that it inspires that motivation that you can have multiple outlets for the same technology. This is much more niche. I'm not a business person. I'd certainly rely on Tyler's input and other inputs, but I would say, like Chip, why are you open sourcing? And the licenses that exist generally are not considered open source licenses that try to support that model that you've described.
He is correct that there is an intellectual debate on whether you're really doing open source if you adopt one of these more modern licenses that impose that restriction. One downgrade from that, which is equally controversial, is there is SSPL license, which allows other people to host it, but if they make improvements in the process of hosting it, they have to give those improvements back, which for a lot of people achieves, the goal that they've got. And what I'd ask you is, as a business person, if you believe that your core discipline is around having expertise on doing this journaling and note-taking app, and that you want to monetize on a hosted experience, you need to be the very best hosted experience on that. So the customer on-ramp, the customer engagement, the overall experience that they've got. And so if that is how you're going to build a scalable and profitable business, then I would welcome competitors who are also hosting, because you need to be the very best, and you're going to win more of the market regardless on that front. So I'd be thinking about it. And if you couldn't get comfortable with that you didn't have an avenue to being the very, very best, and that you couldn't take on the competition, then maybe your strategy needs some tweaking there.
Just to balance out this perspective, then, since I think, while I agree that whether the open source is the best way to go here is the actually interesting question, but I want to point out that this as a perspective, if you are at the point, if you have somebody else competing with you on hosting or anything, you're already like a wild success in terms of this project, right? So the 99% of the project, you didn't get to that point. So I think, if your gut is telling you that this is, you'd have more fun doing open source, by all means go for it. I don't think everything needs to be really carefully thought from the beginning. And I think the life has a way of working out. And I'm sure this whatever monetary success from, let's say, hosting is probably not the only thing or the biggest thing you want to get out of it. So, if this open source, this might getting you in touch with some really smart people, and that turns the interesting direction. Who knows? So trust your gut and go for it is what I wanted to say.
I love that answer, but I would add to it: take a note in your note-taking app that you could show to VCs later, or to somebody else you're going to sell the business to, that that was the premise, and relax if you have competition. That means you're winning, right? because I mean, a lot of these companies that, the point that Tyler was making about there's some emergent, there's some emergent licenses, and this is that whole AWS versus Elastic conversation, right? Elastic is wildly successful in adoption. And as part of doing that, a really big player in the broader market that they're in has come in and said, thank you for the code, we're going to host this thing now. That's a problem that you can run into. So just write the note down in your note app. Remember that was the route to go down, which was one of more, enjoyment, and good things will come. But if you get 100x, if you get 100x sales multiple on evaluation, make sure that everybody understands that was.
You won't be getting it from me. I won't be giving that sort of ridiculousness. I know others who will, but it won't come from me.
Well, there's a lot of SPAC money floating around right now, just looking what to do with them. So.
Cool. Thank you guys. That was really insightful.
Any more questions from the community?
I guess I'll go next. Hi, everyone. Yeah, first of all, thanks a lot for this talk. And I'm working on an open source project, which is called Kubeus. So we're trying to make Kubernetes easier and safer to use. So think of it like Alexa for Kubernetes. So kind of that's what we're going to do. So the question I have is, how would you think of where would be the line between the open source project and the commercial offering? So how would you decide which capabilities and features would go to the commercial one and which ones to go to the open source?
Well, I can take a crack at that, because I've reviewed a bunch of companies. There's, first of all, if you're going down that path, you've got two to 3 dozen competitors to deal with. Some of those competitors have raised tens of millions of dollars. Some of those competitors are now embraced by VMware, RedHat, IBM, SUSE. They acquired Rancher. So just first be completely mindful of the competitive dynamic. Of the startups And there's a half dozen or so startups which are really selling themselves as Kubernetes distributions. Their value propositions have all been around manageability, day 2 operations, day 1 installs, maybe a hosted variant, fleet management, cross-cluster coordination. Again, it's the manageability of the systems itself on that, and it's those manageability features is how they've chosen to draw the line. And some of them are making money on that because a lot of people, there's a lot of organizations that don't want to hire up a pretty big organization to deal with Kubernetes operations. The one thing I tell all the people and all the startups that come to us and pitch on this sort of front is that it is the inevitable nature of platform providers, particularly the really large platform providers like VMware, IBM, Red Hat, Microsoft, Google, that the platform over time will erode the value of the management tier on top of that. It's just inevitable that those providers will look at the management solutions that are being sold aggressively by the startups, and it's in their nature to add to that, either drive that down into the open source so that everybody has it, or that those other vendors will tend to add it, creating less and less surface area for a vendor like that. The only question is, how long does it take? In the case of the Oracle database, I worked for a company. We had Quest Software Oracle database management tools to the tune of $300 million of revenue a year, and it took Oracle the better part of 20 years before they decided, oh, that's kind of a good lunch and we want to eat it on that front. So it was a really great business for us, and it was healthy for a long period of time. In the case of the Kubernetes space, you've got a project that's created nearly $150 billion of market value, and all the major software vendors on the planet have deemed it strategic. So I don't think that it's going to be 20 years for them to work on that. I think there's very powerful interests who are going to work very aggressively to prevent the emergence of a large standalone on that front. So I'm not saying this to discourage you. I'm saying it to that you need to have a strategy and be really crystal clear on what you're going to do if that's the market that you're going to go into on that front.
And move quickly, because that's a fast-moving market.
Of course.
Yeah. Two things I wanted to add. One is, so I had a similar experience with Jenkins or Klaviyo, and I can tell you some of the things that eventually didn't work, or like a creative, like a struggle, right? When you try to do enterprise product, it turns out that many of the contributors to the project, they also use Jenkins in like this highly enterprise context. So the kind of itch they want to scratch tend to be in the similar space. So sometimes occasionally, like we find our enterprise product in the collision course with this natural organic growth in the direction that open source was going, and then like hilarity ensued, and so that has been difficult. I also wanted to talk a bit about the other things on the enterprise product that you can do around the open source, like a training, for example, has been actually great in the early days of the companies, because like you show up and you come across the subject matter experts because it's project you're doing, and you show up in the classroom and you have like 20 people, 40 people paying like a sizable money, and then they also become like, you get to talk to real users, and some of them become eventual customers of the product. And so I don't know, we are in the life cycle of the company you are, but there are lots more things than just, the enterprise product you could do around your project. That might, maybe not that's not the whole thing you do forever, but it's been very helpful for us.
Yeah, that's like an alternative way, right, to start with.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Any other community questions?
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. This is my name is Hui. I'm an AI scientist from IBM. So I guess from a little bit out of the community kind of a question. So in AI, as you know, PyTorch and TensorFlow has been like probably one of two of the most really important advancement for AI research. Really helpful. I kind of wonder from a business model perspective, what do you guys think of it in terms of impact? I guess, sorry, the question if it's too open-ended.
Well, I think the motivations are slightly different, but they have some similarities. They're both coming from very large companies who have a direct route to monetization internally by how they leverage those technologies, and they just directly benefit from broader community contributions and that sense of sort of industry de facto standardization, because now you have a bunch of data scientists using this common tool set and helping exposing the sort of shortcomings and helping advance the state of the art. So it's been really beneficial for each of the corporate entities that are basically the key sponsors behind Facebook and Google behind those projects. I think it's a very reasonable way to look at open source in this context. So I don't know if that answers your question exactly, Hui, but it's an interesting space. There are, I think, data science in general, the tools tend to be open source more so than other areas of IT. Partly it's just generational when the tools have been created, and the ways in which you see monetization are quite different. So in the TensorFlow example, that's about cloud resources being consumed, and in the PyTorch, it's an internal tool. So they have these different business models around the value of open source, and there's the types of competition, the concerns around competition that we would have been talking about earlier look totally differently.
So I guess, thank you for your answer. I guess what kind of piqued my interest, or I guess raised my question, is that PyTorch, at least from research community, I bet, I would say most of my colleagues probably choose to use PyTorch, and probably the rest use TensorFlow, right? And I'm actually wondering, and I think these tools make it kind of easier to develop simple AI models, not even in the AI sense, in the AI research sense. Would there be lots of computation traffic actually get implemented on, say, on AWS or maybe on IBM Cloud? That's actually not really contributing. So like maybe other companies are benefiting more than, say, FAIR, who is the entity that started PyTorch. So I guess I wonder whether it's within their expectation or not that maybe other companies benefit more.
Well, the other companies kind of are at this point because of the success of Python for data scientists and PyTorch and TensorFlow. We are in an emergent age of machine learning, where machine learning used to be the domain of very narrow and small groups within IT or even within a business where you had a very particular type of data sets. And now it's turning into the point where every organization has to be doing machine learning across all of its data to get insights. And every software project that's getting built needs to have some machine learning engine component to make recommendations or forecasts or whatever that is. So machine learning is becoming a de facto standard. And so the complexity of the life cycle around machine learning projects is where a lot of the pain has emerged recently. And so there's a whole category called ML ops, and there's roughly about 80 startups that are competing in and around ML ops. And these are various products that do things like feature stores. They provide pipeline, ML processing pipelines, data cleansing. All the sorts of things that move from a data scientist doing a little bit of work with TensorFlow and progressing that into something that becomes a production prediction system for that. And most of the businesses that are doing particularly well, then the ones that have raised a lot of money, guess what? They're based off of open source technologies. And those businesses generally aren't associated with PyTorch or TensorFlow. And so the companies that created this great end user tool, if you will, are not really capitalizing on the commercial opportunity, which has been more in the MLOps space on that front.
So this conversation, I was thinking about the Monopoly, that board game where you go around the board and you buy up the real estate. And so as a player, like it's So you always think about like in this trade, like am I on the shorter end of the stick as opposed to the guy I'm trying to trade? And somewhat paradoxically, like what you actually want to do is that even if you're not gaining as much as the other guy, so long as you're gaining something, it's actually worth a trade. And I think the same thing happens with open source or this, the titles. Like the inventor of these projects might not be currently benefiting the most, and but I think actually it could still make sense, and I think that's the beauty of open source. I used to work for some microsystem where we invented Java, but we royally screwed up monetization. So this this feels close to me, but I think it was still very much worthwhile for Sun to do it. And, so I don't know the context in which this question happens, but let's also not forget that this is not a zero-sum game in open source.
Actually, I can add something here because I used to work on the TensorFlow team, and really, I think it comes down to the point Chris made earlier about operationalization. I don't know about Facebook's interest, but for Google, certainly now that they've started to build hardware that's particularly well suited to run those kinds of machine learning models on, they can operationalize like the TensorFlow experience much better than any other cloud provider is going to be able to, and that's going to be an advantage. I think that sort of just grows over time unless someone else can come and do the same kind of thing. So I think it's hard to judge. Just I think Chris or Chip correctly identified that it's really about the cloud providers, and the advantages are in operationalization. I think for these frameworks.
Thank you.
If you want to be blown away, by the way, go check out. And I'm not an investor, but go check out Bodo.ai. You get to use regular Python with pandas and NumPy. No other libraries required, and you can get analytics processing like you get Databricks, but at 100 times the speed on that.
Photo.ai?
Bodo with a B.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any more questions from the community? We're almost. I think we have time for one more question. Yeah.
Sure, it's Vikram here. Again, similar question to you guys in terms of like an open source business model. So like my understanding of open source would be is like you have obviously the developer model that you can share with the community, but when you're saying selling an open source license to enterprises, I know like companies like RedHat, you guys make money on the services and the expertise because not everyone knows how to support an open source stack. Is there a model though where you can charge a annual license fee to the enterprise, even though they have the ability to modify their code as they speak? Does that question make sense?
Yes. I would say the answer to your question is yes. There are many companies that have that model. They tend to be in the embedded space, and that tends to be a legacy model. So I would be really careful because and maybe for subtle clarity, we actually sell a subscription, which is inclusive of software as well as some services. It's not a license, but there's some similarities, but it does include access to software. The access to software does not include support around customers modifying that software. Embedded companies tend to do that. It's much more of a professional services type engagement. So you're kind of giving an SDK to a customer and saying, good luck, knock yourself out and we'll help you as you get stuck. And if you go to the valuation side of the equation, professional services companies don't get the same valuations that software product, commercial product type companies do. So it's a very different business model. And I would say it's one that's not that services themselves are fading, but providing support to customers that are going to modify software that you're giving them. I would be careful of that. It's really expensive. It's really labor intensive. It's people intensive. And I don't know that it's the right model as we roll forward, as you see more focus on standardization across the industry.
Yeah, one thing I'll just point out, there was I think SourceGraph about 5 years ago was trying to create something called a fair source license. I think that's what it was called. I don't know if it had broad adoption, but the fair source license basically allowed for a fixed number of users that you define And then any number of users within a single organization beyond that require a commercial license on top of that. There.
Thank you.
You define.
I think it's a good time to end the session. Thank you, Chip. Thank you, Tyler. Thank you, Kohsuke, and thank you, Chris. It was really, I mean, I enjoyed it. Certainly, I think the community enjoyed it as well. Thanks. We really appreciate it.